The Ford Motor Company is one of the biggest car brands in the United States and is up there with other big car brands like Toyota, Volkswagen, Hyundai, and General Motors. With subsidiaries scattered across Asia and Europe, Ford stands tall as an international brand. But, like every other big gun in the industry, it didn't start off big. The Ford Motor Company, as we know it today, is the fruit of several experiments by a farm boy who wouldn't give up. This includes his experiments with mechanical engines and, most importantly, his several experiments with business failure. So how did this farm boy move from experimenting on engines in his garage to failing severally in business and eventually building one of the biggest car brands in the world? In this video, we'll weave our way through the story of how a passion for machines drove an ambitious farm boy from a Michigan farm to establishing one of America's biggest car companies. This is the fascinating and inspiring story of the birth of the Ford Motor Company. Chapter 1: The Self-Taught Genius. The story of Ford begins not with Henry the engineer, but with Henry the farm boy growing up on his father's farm in Dearborn, Michigan. In the 1860s, it was common to be on a farm, and as a boy, you were expected to work with the men and learn the ropes of managing a farm. However, Henry was different from other boys. He did not make any effort to learn much about farming. Something else had his attention. At first, he was obsessed with the steam engine and how it worked, so he hung around men who ran these engines and eventually picked up a thing or two from the men. But the most fascinating part of his development as an engineer was that he learned most of what he knew about engines on his own. In other words, he was self-taught. So from learning how to fix watches by just observing them, he graduated to consuming as many books as he could on the rudiments of machine design. Before long, he organized other boys his age to build rudimentary water wheels and steam engines. With this, his path in life became clear. He would not follow in his father's footsteps as a farmer. Rather, his future lay elsewhere as an engineer. But how will he navigate the uncertain journey from a farm boy to achieving his lifetime ambition of creating machines? The next stage of his life is filled with ups and downs that eventually led to the creation of the masterpiece that launched his career. Chapter 2: From Boyhood Fascination to the First Creation. For someone born on a Dearborn, Michigan farm in the 1860s, there was actually no future beyond the farm, and pursuing a life beyond the bounds of the farm meant taking on significant risks. So when Henry left his father's farm for the unknown, he was taking on a gamble, one that could end with him returning to the farm with nothing, or with him making a mark in the world beyond his father's farm. At first, his gamble produced the second result. He kicked off his career working as an apprentice with the Michigan Car Company, which manufactured railroad cars. However, he didn't last long on the job. You see, from an early age, Henry's life has been marked by an intense desire to learn new things about machines and machinery. He spent the next 2.5 years bouncing around similar jobs, until one day, he was left with nothing. There's no job, no money, and no great invention that would change the world. The self-taught genius had hit rock bottom, but he was not out of options because he could return to his father's farm and live out his life as a farmer. So in 1882, he gathered his things and left for his father's farm, penniless but rich in the vast knowledge he had gathered from working with various engineering companies. With the farm boy back to his roots, the next logical step would be to go back to his father's occupation, right? Well, it would take more than just one setback to drown a dream that, at this point, has become an obsession. So rather than work on the farm, he decided to build his life around machines once again. This time, he operated and serviced the common portable steam engines used in farming. It was during this period of his life that he landed the role in the Edison Electric Illuminating Company that would set him on the path to establishing his car company. Meanwhile, working for the company was a step away from his comfort zone because Henry knew next to nothing about electricity. But this was not a problem for him because it was another opportunity to learn something new. His move to an electric company, though challenging at the initial stages, was the right push to bring out the best in him. This would show in his meteoric rise from a junior engineer with very little knowledge of electrical engineering to the chief engineer of the illuminating company in just 6 years. However, despite this rapid rise to the peak of his career in the company, he wasn't satisfied. He had another interest that had occupied his mind all through his rise in the company. You see, although he was working for an electric illumination company, he didn't let go of his boyhood passion for working on machines. Meanwhile, somewhere along the line, he had developed an obsession with the idea of a car propelled by a gasoline engine. In the early stages of his career with the company, the dream was hindered by two things. The first was the absence of enough funds to experiment with his idea. and the second was the lack of space to pursue such a lofty goal. However, by 1891, as the chief engineer of the company, he had both the resources and the space to pursue his lifelong goal of building a horseless carriage propelled by a gasoline engine. The 1890s were an interesting time in the United States because around the country there were scores of engineers working in barns and small shops to build horseless carriages. While most of them dropped the idea when it overwhelmed them, the few who persevered till they got a tangible result became the first car companies in America. One of the successful groups that would eventually produce a viable product was Henry Ford and the team of his friends, who rolled out their first self-propelled vehicle in 1896, the Ford Quadricycle. The Quadricycle was a machine far beyond its time, although it combined some already known technology. First off, the carriage was balanced on 4 wire wheels that looked like heavy bicycle wheels. The machine was steered with a tiller that looked like something from a boat. However, unlike modern cars, the Quadricycle could only move forward because it had 2 forward speeds and no reverse. This is nowhere near what we have today, but it was cutting-edge technology at the time. So with the success of his first car, it was time to launch his car company, right? Yes, Henry did launch his car company, but although he created some great cars, what followed was a series of failures that almost see him give up his lifelong dream. But how did he weather the storms to build one of America's first car companies? Hang in there as we unpack the story of failure, trial and error, risks, and eventual success. Chapter 3. From the Quadricycle to the Ford Motor Company. Henry's success with the Quadricycle brought him instant fame. The farm boy who bet on leaving his father's Michigan farm to chase his dream of working with machines had succeeded beyond his imagination. But this was just the beginning. At this point, he had the audience of none other than the great inventor and chairman of the Edison Illuminating Company of Detroit, Thomas Edison. With his encouragement and the financial backing of Detroit lumber baron William Murphy, Ford left the Edison Company to design his second vehicle and float his first car company, the Detroit Automobile Company, on August 5, 1899. The Detroit Automobile Company was Henry Ford's first attempt at running a company, and in no time, it became clear to him that to run a successful company, he needed a different skill set than what was needed to build a vehicle. So in January 1901, barely 2 years after floating his first company, a combination of low-quality products and higher prices drove the Detroit Automobile Company to the ground. Despite this failure, one thing was evident: Henry Ford's ability to design good automobiles. A few months after the failure of his first company, he made a comeback. This time, with the help of Harold Wills, he built something different from his first 2 cars, a 26-horsepower racing automobile. The success of this racing car led to the formation of his second company, the Henry Ford Company, in November 1901. The new arrangement had Ford as the chief engineer and some stakeholders from the failed company as members of the board. The Henry Ford Company succeeded until a disagreement with some members of the board made Henry Ford turn his back on his second company. With Henry gone, they renamed that Henry Ford Company to the Cadillac Automobile Company. Despite the failure of the second company, Ford teamed with ex-racing cyclist Tom Cooper to build an 80-horsepower monster racer, the 999. This rugged racer is iconic because in October 1902, Barney Oldfield drove it to victory in a race. Riding on the back of this success, Ford launched yet another company. This time, it was a partnership with an old acquaintance known as Ford and Malcolmson, Ltd. They went into contract with 2 brothers known as the Dodge Brothers to supply them with over $160,000 in parts. But despite Ford's goal of building affordable automobiles, sales did not go as he anticipated. So once again, his company was in hot water. And after the Dodge Brothers received their payment, Ford had to close the shop. You see, once is a fluke, twice is enough to be worried about, but 3 failures meant something was very wrong with Ford's approach to business. Ford was simply too obsessed with the idea of producing very affordable automobiles, which led him to sacrifice profits and, over time, tank the company. Meanwhile, despite the failure of their partnership, Malcolmson stuck with Henry Ford, and together they convinced the Dodge Brothers to accept a portion of the new company, which incorporated the previous partnership to form the Ford Motor Company. But this time, they took one precaution that would save the company from collapse. Henry Ford's obsession with lower prices made him too volatile to run a company, so they elected someone else as president, while Ford handled the technical side of things. Thus, the Ford Motor Company was formed, growing over time to become one of the biggest car makers the world has ever seen till date. So from a genius farm boy, Henry grew, honed his skills, failed multiple times, and recovered to form the Ford Motor Company. Maybe you can, too.